I want to give you a personal testimony of a savage storm that I went through. I have debated for months whether to tell this personal story.
For more than 50 years, he stood untouchable, the most powerful preacher in Texas, the man who could shake a presidential campaign with a single sermon and send millions of dollars flowing into his ministry with nothing more than a warning about the end of the world. But the empire he built was always sitting on top of something cracked. And lately, those cracks have started to spread in ways that even his most loyal followers can no longer ignore. And the man who spent a lifetime warning everyone else about judgment is now the one with the whole world watching to see how this finally ends. The trouble he cannot preach his way out of. John Hagee is 86 years old, and the ministry that carries his name is still running at full speed in 2026, still streaming from Cornerstone Church in San Antonio nearly every single day of the week. On the surface, everything looks perfectly fine. The camera rolls. The congregation fills the seats. The worship rises. The donations keep coming in, just like they always have. But underneath that polished surface, a very different story has been building for a very long time. And it has nothing to do with worship music, or Sunday crowds, or birthday tributes. It has to do with money that was never fully accounted for, with power that was never seriously challenged, and with a long list of statements so inflammatory that critics have spent decades waiting for them to finally catch up with him. For most of his career, John Hagee was strong enough to bury all of it under the sheer force of his reputation. He could outshout any accusation, outlast any reporter, and outmaneuver any rival. The trouble for him now is that the reputation is aging right alongside the man, and the old questions are growing louder at exactly the moment he has the least strength left to fight them off. Because here is the uncomfortable truth that his supporters do not like to sit with for very long. This is a preacher who has been investigated, scrutinized, and publicly accused for the better part of his entire career. Newspaper reporters have dug deep into his finances. Watchdog groups that exist solely to expose corruption in religious organizations have placed his ministry directly under the microscope. His own recorded words have been turned into full-blown national scandals on more than one occasion. Any single one of those storms would have been enough to permanently end an ordinary man, to drive him out of the pulpit and into hiding. Hagee survived every last one of them, and he did it while still growing richer and more powerful. And to understand why the walls might finally be closing in on him now, you first have to understand how high he climbed, and more importantly, how much he had to bury along the way to get there. Because long before he was untouchable, John Hagee was a man who had already lost absolutely everything once, the fall they keep quiet about. The official story of John Hagee almost always begins in 1975, the year Cornerstone Church was born. That is the version his ministry loves to tell from the stage, the triumphant origin of an empire. But that polished beginning is not where the real story starts at all. The real story starts with a collapse so total and so humiliating that it should have ended him before he ever became a household name. And it is the chapter his organization works very hard to keep quiet. He was born in April of 1940 into a Texas family that had been preaching the gospel for generations. The Hagee name carried a kind of inheritance, a calling passed down through the bloodline like a family business. He rose fast, and he rose young. By 1966, he had already planted a church in San Antonio called Trinity, and the ambitious young preacher looked completely unstoppable. Then, it all came apart at the seams. In the middle of the 1970s, his first marriage was shattered in the most damaging way imaginable for a man of the pulpit, in a scandal that involved another woman. For a preacher, that was not a private heartbreak. It was a public execution carried out in front of everyone who had ever believed in him. He lost the church he had built. He lost the trust of the congregation that had followed him and funded him. He lost the very inheritance his family had carried for generations. And he lost it through his own choices. Sit for a moment with the crushing weight of that silence. A man raised from birth to believe the pulpit was his sacred birthright, now sitting alone in the wreckage of his own life, genuinely wondering whether God himself was finished with him for good. What grew out of that improbable second chance is honestly almost impossible to measure in full. When he kept following the money. Cornerstone Church today holds a congregation of around 22,000 members, a staggering number by any standard. But the church itself was only ever the foundation, the base of something far larger. On top of it, Hagee built a sprawling television operation that broadcast his sermons day and night, a media company to package and sell his message, an entire network of Christian schools, and a broadcast reach that carried his booming voice into millions of homes across the country and around the entire world. He had gone from a ruined and forgotten local preacher to one of the most recognizable religious figures in all of America, and the offerings poured in to match. And the bigger that empire grew, the louder one single question became impossible to silence. Where exactly does all of that money actually go? Now this is not some bitter question dreamed up by his enemies to smear him. Back in the early 2000s, serious and respected journalists at the San Antonio Express-News, working alongside watchdog groups that specialize in tracking the finances of religious organizations, began digging hard into exactly that question. They examined his compensation in detail. They examined his salary. They examined a ministry-owned home that came attached to his position, a benefit that raised more than a few eyebrows. And the picture that slowly emerged from all that reporting made a great many people uneasy, including, quietly, some of his own faithful followers. The figures that surfaced in the coverage were large enough that estimates of his personal fortune have climbed into the millions in the years since, all of it built on the donations of ordinary working people who trusted him completely. The hardest and most specific dollar figures that have been attached to him over the years often come from later retellings and secondary accounts, rather than from clean documents that you and I could simply pull up and verify for ourselves today. But please do not let that small caveat distract you from what is rock solid, because the solid part is damaging enough on its own. The scrutiny was absolutely real. The investigations genuinely happened. Respected, credentialed reporters asked hard and pointed questions about how a single preacher manages to accumulate that kind of personal wealth from the weekly offerings of factory workers and retirees and single mothers. And here is the thing that should bother anyone watching. Those questions never once received the kind of clean, transparent, final answer that makes a financial scandal actually go away. They simply sat there, year after year after year, a quiet and persistent shadow stretching across everything he ever built. Money makes people whisper, though. It very rarely makes a man into a full-blown national scandal all on its own. What truly turned John Hagee into a coast-to-coast controversy, not once but several times over, was never really his bank account at all. It was his own mouth. And the things that came out of that mouth, spoken with total confidence from his own pulpit, would eventually reach all the way into a presidential race and explode in the most spectacular and humiliating fashion imaginable. The words that will not die. In September of 2006, he sat down for an interview with National Public Radio, and the conversation eventually turned to Hurricane Katrina, the catastrophic storm that had drowned New Orleans and killed well over 1,000 human beings just the year before. What he said about that unspeakable tragedy still stops people cold the very first time they hear it. He claimed, with total conviction, that the city of New Orleans had reached a level of sin so deeply offensive to God that the storm itself had been an act of divine punishment. He pointed specifically to a gay pride event that he said had been planned in the city, and he called that deadly hurricane, in his own exact words, the judgment of God against the city of New Orleans. Stop and imagine for one moment being one of the grieving families who had just lost their home, their neighborhood, and their loved ones beneath that black water, and then turning on the radio to hear a wealthy and famous preacher calmly inform the entire nation that God had aimed the storm directly at you on purpose. As ugly and as cruel as that particular firestorm was, believe it or not, it was not even the comment that ended up hurting him the most. That grim distinction belongs to something he had preached several years earlier about Adolf Hitler. In a sermon that resurfaced and then spread across the early internet like wildfire, Hagee taught his congregation that God had deliberately sent a hunter to drive the Jewish people back toward the land of Israel. And then he said the handful of words that would haunt him for the rest of his natural life. He said that a hunter is someone who comes with a gun and forces you. And then he said, plainly, that Hitler was a hunter. He had folded the single most monstrous figure of the entire 20th century neatly into a divine plan, and the raw audio of him saying it is still out there for anyone to find today. His voice perfectly calm and steady as the words leave his lips. In 2008, that old recording walked straight into the center of national politics and detonated like a bomb. Senator John McCain, who was running hard for president, had proudly and publicly accepted Hagee's endorsement, hoping it would help deliver millions of crucial evangelical voters to his campaign. Then, the Hitler sermon surfaced for the whole country to hear. By May of that year, McCain found himself with no choice at all but to publicly and forcefully reject the very endorsement he had so eagerly welcomed just weeks earlier, a deeply humiliating reversal for both men. Hagee's response was wounded, defensive, and raw. He said that the past 24 hours had been extremely painful and disappointing to him, that to hear people who knew absolutely nothing about his life or his work claim that he somehow excused the Holocaust was simply untrue and heartbreaking, and that he had in fact devoted most of his entire adult life to making certain there would never be a second Holocaust anywhere on Earth. And running quietly underneath all of those public explosions was his long and ugly record of incendiary language aimed at the Roman Catholic Church, an institution he had described in his own published writing as the Great Whore and as an apostate church, words so inflammatory and so offensive to so many millions of people that he was eventually forced to publicly soften and walk them back when the political heat finally grew too intense for even him to survive. Any single one of these scandals, standing entirely alone, would have permanently sunk a normal career and ended a normal man. John Hagee somehow managed to carry all of them at once. And the only reason he was able to do that is tied directly to the one great cause that became his shield, his army, and the consuming obsession of the entire second half of his life. The shield that protected him. In 2006, the very same year he was busy telling the nation that Katrina had been divine punishment, John Hagee founded the organization that would become the true and lasting source of his untouchable power. He called it Christians United for Israel, and to this very day he describes it, in his own ministry's official words, as a 10 million member organization that he and his wife Diana built together from nothing. This single fact is the key that unlocks the entire mystery of how a man manages to survive saying the unthinkable over and over again and walk away each time. Hagee's deepest and most unshakable conviction is that the modern nation of Israel sits at the absolute center of God's plan for the end of the world, and that Christians everywhere have a sacred, non-negotiable duty to defend it without question and without hesitation. That one belief transformed him from a merely controversial Texas preacher into a genuine and feared political force in Washington. His organization holds enormous summits in the nation's capital every single year. It mobilizes evangelical voters by the literal millions. When American politicians of either party talk carefully about the evangelical bond with Israel, they are talking, whether they ever admit it out loud or not, about the powerful machine that John Hagee personally built with his own hands. And that very machine is the precise reason he was able to survive the Hitler firestorm when it should have destroyed him completely. To his millions of devoted supporters, a man who had poured his entire life and a sizable fortune into defending and protecting the Jewish people simply could not possibly be their secret enemy, no matter how shocking or how indefensible a single old sermon happened to sound. His relentless passion for Israel became the thick armor that absorbed every blow his own reckless words invited upon him. Even now, in 2026, with the Middle East dominating the headlines night after night, the messages pouring steadily out of his ministry still carry titles like Why Israel Matters and The Unbroken Covenant. The cause has not cooled even slightly. If anything, it has only grown hotter and more urgent in the eyes of his followers. But there exists one single threat in this world that no political army, no sprawling media empire, and no powerful cause on earth can ever truly shield a man from, and at 86 years old, John Hagee is now staring directly into the face of it. The reckoning he cannot escape. Here is where the entire story finally turns, because age is quietly doing to John Hagee the one thing that no scandal, no relentless journalist, and no powerful political opponent ever once managed to accomplish in 50 long years. It is steadily taking away his strength. His ministry posted a warm tribute for his 85th birthday back in April of last year, a quiet and telling marker of a man entering the final stretch of an extraordinarily long road. Reports describe a body that has been worn down by serious physical trials, including major heart surgery and a difficult neurological condition that visibly limits what he is still able to do. The booming, towering, unstoppable figure from 1975 is simply not the same man you see on the screen today. And absolutely everyone who tunes in can see it plainly written on his face. And this is the exact moment when all of those old, unanswered questions come flooding back at once, all together. The money was never fully explained to anyone's satisfaction. The hateful words that were never genuinely taken back. The string of scandals that he was always somehow strong enough, rich enough, and connected enough to simply outlast. For decade after decade, the unspoken answer to every single accusation thrown his way was simply that John Hagee was far too powerful, far too useful, and far too well protected to ever actually be held to real account for any of it. But power fades with time. Protection always thins out eventually. The vast army he built is ultimately loyal to the cause itself, not necessarily to a frail and aging man who can no longer command a room or shake a stage the way he so easily once did. And the longer he chooses to remain in the public eye, the more the watching world seems to be waiting, quietly and patiently, to see whether the very reckoning he spent an entire lifetime preaching about everyone else might, at long last, circle all the way back around to him. What makes the whole thing even more striking is that he has already quietly begun handing the entire empire away. The pulpit of Cornerstone Church now belongs largely to his son, Matthew Hagee, the sixth generation of the family to carry that storied name forward, now leading that massive congregation of 22,000 souls. So the aging founder is deliberately stepping back into the shadows. The hard questions about his money and his words still sit there completely unanswered. And the very spotlight that once made him utterly untouchable is now simply hovering over him, watching and waiting to see exactly what remains of the man once all his protection finally runs out for good. The preacher who built his entire towering life and fortune on warning the whole world about a final and inescapable judgment may now be about to discover firsthand what it actually feels like to stand alone underneath one of his very own. What do you really think is going on here with John Hagee? A powerful man finally being forced to face the consequences of a lifetime of scandal and controversy, or simply an old preacher being unfairly hounded in his final and weakest years? Drop your honest thoughts down in the comments below.